One of the funny things about documenting the PC Engine library is that when I hit the big games, they're still fairly obscure. I'm not fond of talking about the giant hits of the 8-bit era, because they've been talked about to death. But Splatterhouse? One of the most visible and notable games on the PC Engine and TurboGrafx-16? It's still barely a footnote. And that means I've got a lot to say about it. Splatterhouse was originally an arcade game that Namco released in 1988, and it was a fairly big deal, not just for players but for Namco. Namco was terrified of a public backlash against the game and wound up micromanaging the entire development process. Exactly how much blood and gore they could show was a contentious issue. Now, I know that the playground rumors in the US was that Japanese games always had all of the cool stuff stripped out when they came to America. And of course, cool stuff meant topless women and blood. Well, I think 5 years into my documentation project, it's pretty clear that Japanese publishers did not give their game developers free rein. But there were differences between the platforms. We've already seen how NEC was fine with sexual content on the PC Engine, and now Splatterhouse was going to test the boundaries for violence. Over on the Famicom, Nintendo didn't want any of that. They were just as controversy adverse in Japan as they were in the US. That's why, in 1989, when Namco released a version of Splatterhouse on the Famicom, it was Splatterhouse Wanpaku Graffiti, a total ground-up reworking of the game to make everything cutesy. And then over on the PC Engine, the port of Splatterhouse was obviously scaled back from the arcade, but it was still pushing things pretty hard, especially for 1990. The splatter in Splatterhouse is explicitly referring to splatter movies, a subgenre of horror with a focus on presenting the audience with gore. Obviously, such films have been targets of moral panics around the world. Calling that out in the title was a fairly big deal. The plot of Splatterhouse is a generic horror film setup. There was a Dr. West who owned a remote mansion, and he was a parapsychologist with an interest in reanimating. After he was killed by a monster, people avoided his mansion, calling it a Splatterhouse. Rick was a student studying parapsychology at university, and he wanted to examine the house, so he brought his girlfriend Jennifer with him up to the mansion. They were attacked by monsters, Rick was left for dead, and Jennifer was hauled into the mansion. But while Rick was dying, he heard the voice of the Hell Mask, and by donning it, he gained vast physical power, capable of dealing with the monsters in Splatterhouse. So the first thing you're going to notice, if you're not familiar with Splatterhouse, is that Rick looks exactly like Jason. And I mean exactly. This had to be changed for the US release, because while they could get away with it in Japan, they really would not be able to in the US. There's a handful of other changes between the US and Japanese version. Like for this boss, they changed an inverted cross into a monster face. But for the most part, the game crossed the ocean with very few changes. Splatterhouse is a single-plane beat-em-up, a style that fixes them in a side-scrolling plane rather than letting their heroes move freely in a space. Button 1 jumps and button 2 attacks. You can press down, and attacking then will always result in a low kick, while pressing up makes Rick face the wall, an action that does something useful at only one point in the entire game, though you could always look at yourself in the mirror. Attacking a single time while jumping will turn that into a jump kick, but repeated attacks in the air will turn that into punching. There's one more special move, and while it's a little tough to pull off, it is absolutely vital for beating the game. If you jump and don't attack, and instead press diagonally down, then attack the instant before you hit the ground, Rick will perform a slide kick. The slide kick does extra damage, travels a long distance, and it's really tough to get hurt while you're performing the move. There are bosses where the slide kick is effectively required in order to beat them, but the timing on the slide kick is incredibly tight. Also, the instructions in the manual, both in Japanese and English, for how to perform the slide kick are incorrect. They tell you that all you need to do is push down. Getting a feel for the timing of that slide kick is a key point to doing well here. There are also weapons in most stages of Splatterhouse, and if you see them, you'll definitely want to pick them up, because unless you're doing a slide kick, your fist and feet aren't very effective. Weapons can't be carried across area transitions, so use them or lose them. Weapons come in 3 varieties. You've got the melee attacks. These extend Rick's reach and do a little bit of extra damage. Thrown items, where you have one shot, but they'll do hefty damage to an enemy that's far away. And then the shotgun, which is also a ranged weapon, and picking one up comes with 8 shells. For melee weapons, the most common one you're going to find is a 2x4. These are just lying around in early stages, and it's a pretty good weapon that will even splatter some enemies against the wall. Against the 4th stage boss, you'll find a cleaver, and that just helps you out with a little bit of extra reach. For thrown weapons, there's simple things like the rocks and wrench, but in one particular room, there's racks of spears. Those are a lot more effective when thrown. The shotgun only appears on stage 3, and its biggest weakness is that you can't duck and shoot. So even though there's enemies that are crawling along the ground, you'll still have to kick them. Splatterhouse has 7 stages, and every stage is broken up into segments. Stage 1 is just a warm-up as you go through an underground passage, and then you have to fight a writhing mass that will release enormous leeches from time to time. This boss introduces another way that Splatterhouse copies horror films. When you think the boss is dead, it comes back one last time. Stage 2 initially starts you out in a dungeon, but then you go into a sewer, and you'll have to be cautious about jumping over mines. The hitboxes in Splatterhouse are actually pretty generous in your favor. You hit from further away than it seems, and you can get closer to damage sources than it seems. The boss for Stage 2 is a poltergeist that attacks you with all of the objects in the room. This is a good example of how you really have to learn the patterns in order to do well in Splatterhouse, since this boss will attack the same way every time, but if you're not ready for those attacks, then you're going to get hit. Stage 3 has you walking through a forest, and this introduces another complication: branching paths. There's some light spots on the bridge halfway through, and if you step on one of those, you're dragged down into the water below, and you have to complete the sub-area before you can move on. This is the stage with the shotguns, and they give you one at the very start, and one right before the boss. That boss is Piggy Man, a giant monster that will leap around and has chainsaws for hands. After you burn through all of your shotgun shells, you pretty much have to use slide kicks in order to beat it. Otherwise, you're just going to take a ton of damage. Finally, for Stage 4, you enter the Splatterhouse itself. Here, Rick will be attacked by his own mirror image, which will sometimes leap out of the background at you. The chapel is where the boss for this stage is, an inverted cross that will summon severed heads and send them flying around the screen. While you can knock the heads away from the cross, the only part that you have to damage is the cross itself. There is a cutscene in the chapel after that where the PC Engine version is missing a sound effect. You're supposed to hear Jennifer scream at this point and then hurry off, but instead you just have a blank gap and then the music changes. Stage 5 is as far as I got while recording. It's the heart of the mansion. A very long stage with some very tough obstacles and lengthy branching paths. These tilted floors will drag you into the hole, and that slide is a lot faster than it looks. On some paths you'll find a pumpkin head that will revive the enemies that you've killed, or you could see the return of some nasty enemies earlier in the game. Once you finally reach Jennifer, she asks for help and then turns into a monster. And this is really Jennifer, not an illusion or fake out. In her monster form, she'll jump around and has claws with an extremely long reach. You won't be able to get close to her unless you use the slide kick. She'll also sometimes transform back in the middle of the fight, but she'll return to the monstrous form a few seconds later. After killing his girlfriend, Rick has to descend into the fleshy pit that the monsters spawned from, and then Stage 7 consists of escaping the burning mansion. In the PC Engine version of Splatterhouse, you start out with 5 hits that you can take before you die, and you recover 2 points of that health when you complete a stage. You also start with 3 lives, and when you die, you usually come back at the start of the segment you were in, but for longer areas there are checkpoints. You can earn extra lives every 30,000 points, and when you game over, you're allowed to continue up to 5 times, though continuing puts you back at the start of that whole act. If you're finding Splatterhouse to be too easy, then you can hold down Select on the title screen, and eventually the word Hard will appear. Though as a hard mode, it doesn't really add anything. It just doubles the health for most monsters. Splatterhouse was enough of a success that it got sequels, but not on the PC Engine. By the time Splatterhouse 2 was in development, Namco was shutting down their PC Engine development group. So instead, Splatterhouse 2 and 3 got released for the Mega Drive. And the game was fondly remembered enough that it got a revival in 2010. Though that one's a dramatically different style of game. Splatterhouse was one of the big games on the PC Engine in Japan. The console was targeting an older audience than the Famicom, and Splatterhouse had everything that a 12-year-old could want in a video game. My own response is a little bit more muted. Splatterhouse is a game that lives and dies on those visual set pieces. And this is one of the coolest looking 8-bit games out there. But at the same time, it isn't really stretching beyond its single-plane beat-em-up origins. It's a bit slow-paced. Rick moves like Jason rather than the martial artists that usually star in these games. And the monsters and obstacles are overwhelming enough that you really have to learn patterns for the game rather than taking it as it comes. Splatterhouse is a game that always left me wanting more. More moves, more enemies, more weapons, more levels, more something. It feels like the final form of the single-plane beat-em-up. Once you've made Splatterhouse, what else can you do with that style of game? So my view on Splatterhouse winds up falling on good, but not great. It's still worth checking out though, just for how stylish it is.